always been about you, always. I said I always been about you. Hey, that's right. We tell her. I said I always. I said it always been about you. Hey, watch this. Hey, hold on. Hey, whoa, yes. Hey.
In spite of pain and life,
Put your hands together.
unrest, when there's no home,
Ain't no hope.
no home I see.
Hey, that's great. And what it do, what it do. I tell them grace that it. Hey, take it up. Sing it, saying that. Every home, every home, every home is. Yeah.
When every home is lost,
Hey, this power time.
Well, good evening, people. Good evening. Thank you for coming on. Pastor Robert Johnson back with you for another broadcast and conversation on Ignite, our weekly faith-based conversation out of St. Mark United Methodist Church, where we try to cultivate human potential and expose you to people who are doing positive and impactful things in our community, our city, and our state. And we're so glad to be back with you. This just a reminder for, when this whole thing started. As a matter of fact, my good friend, our St. Mark member, Nichelle Williams, is navigating the background. Pastor Yolanda's doing some schoolwork, is finishing up her academic curriculum for her Master's of Divinity degree. And so she's plugged deeply into that. Nichelle is navigating the background. This is all Nichelle's production. When COVID hit, Nichelle immediately started putting together tools and saying, we've got to go online. We've got to stay in connection. She created this, took Wednesday night Bible study, created a platform for me, and then it turned into Ignite. And now COVID is just about, folks have pretty much come back, but we're still doing Ignite because it allows us to reach people far beyond the boundaries of our local community. The 67214 zip code and the city of Wichita, we're able to reach into other places and invite other folks to come on and be a part of our conversation. So we will continue, St. Mark will continue using digital virtual resources to reach people and to spread the message of the kingdom and to be of service to people wherever they are. Thank you for tuning in. So Nichelle, thank you for being here with us. She's in the background. Folks, just know she's here. As a matter of fact, those of you that know Nichelle, you should type in the comments, thank you, Nichelle. You are wonderful, because all of our digital stuff at St. Mark, Nichelle, as a volunteer staff person, by the way, which means she has a full-time job. And in addition to her full-time job, she commits hours on top of hours every week to helping St. Mark to execute Sunday morning virtual services, extending our what happens in the building across the country. And then she comes and she's put together these pieces. Our men's Bible study with Steve Thornton and Tony Nuri, that's been going on forever and a day. Those two brothers are so faithful that they took their deal online and they like it so much, they're still online as well. They have not come back in person. But Nichelle, thank you so much. And thank you for coming on tonight to help us navigate. We're praying for Pastor Yolanda. She finishes up her seminary work, that all goes well. Also, Deontay Hayden of St. Markin, who's finishing, he's not about to finish his entire curriculum, but he's finishing, I believe, his second year as a theology student at Perkins School of Theology. He just told me he did his class on systematic theology, had to write a credo, had finished his credo, got a B in the class. He was disappointed in the B, but I told him, hey man, if you get a B in systematic theology, you're doing well. That is excellence. So thank you so much for supporting these folks. And Deontay, Yolanda, we're praying for you all. St. Mark, reach out to us. Let us know you're here. Hello, Jan Peterson, Jan Fox Peterson, Dan Stockamer will be on tomorrow night for another broadcast of Black and White. Let's talk. You've got these three people, one black guy, a white lady, and a white guy who come from radically different backgrounds. Dan says he's been the leader of a local Republican Party. He's been a hippie. He owns a vineyard. Jan has come from a place of church abuse and just is a psychologist, is a counselor, is involved in what we call restorative practice. And then this black guy who originated out of Mississippi is here in the Midwest. So we're radically different, but we're coming together to build a friendship, and we're doing that publicly. So we invite people on to come on and talk to us about what they're doing, how they're helping to heal the human divide. We can really call it the human divide because we're divided in all kinds of ways. And so we do that. Our next broadcast with Black and White is tomorrow night at 7 p.m. And we invite you to come on and be a part of that conversation. Topic for tomorrow night is suicide, depression, and finding hope. And our guest is Jim Yoder. He has a fascinating story and some fascinating information to share with us about that. And so we look forward to tomorrow night, 7 p.m. in the same places where you're watching this broadcast. You can watch Black and White Let's Talk on tomorrow night. All right. So some St. Mark folks who are watching, reach out and let folks know you're here. Invite them to come on because we're about to have a riveting conversation. I've asked Mark McCormick, my good friend Mark McCormick, journalist, activist, author, just historian, asked him to come on and lead this interview. And then, of course, Pastor Kyle is here with us, and we're so glad to have him. As a matter of fact, let's bring Pastor Kyle on, our co-host. Pastor, how are you? Let me move the banner so folks can see.
Here I am. Okay. I'm here.
Hey, Kyle, what's going on over at the Journey this week?
I want to say thank you to Nichelle.
Yeah.
Because Ignite was how I really discovered St. Mark and your ministry.
Wow.
And it was for me, it was right after the George Floyd murder.
Yeah.
And you were having conversations about race and the history of race in the United States. There was a 4-part series that you did, like a Thursday through Sunday, if you remember that.
Yes.
And it was, for me, who is, historically on the outside looking in on some of these conversations, it was it was so helpful to hear the conversation of race in an unfiltered way from the perspective of the Black church.
Wow.
And so so that was so helpful, and that was sort of my introduction to St. Mark.
Wow.
And so I so appreciate the online methodology that she brought to this space. So thank you.
And I hope Nichelle, I'm sure she hears that. Well, I got to tell you, she is amazing. I've been telling people lately, as St. Mark is going through this transition. So as folks are grieving the departure of one pastor, and then but also filled with hope and excitement about the next pastor, part of what I'm saying to people right now is, okay, whether you like Robert or not, whether you're excited about the new guy or not, the leader you are waiting for is you. That what makes great churches, it's so in America, it's like the quarterback. It's like everybody gives the quarterback all the credit, but anybody who knows anything about football knows that a quarterback would be nothing if he didn't have a great offensive line, if he didn't have some skilled players at receiver, if he didn't have a good running game, that you would be. But we tend to put the pastor and say, oh, this church has a. But if you look at churches, it's really some great people. And I've been in great churches, and I know that to be from Windsor Village to just to St. Mark, many other places. If you tell the full story, there were a lot of great people who are part of the story just as much. And so Nichelle is just one of those outstanding people in the local church who gives above and beyond of her time and resources to help make ministry happen. So Nichelle, thank you so much. Let's jump into our conversation. Pascal, is there anything going on over at the Journey that you want to?
Not in particular. I swear we're still kind of recovering from Easter, so that's still ongoing. Oh, no, we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. So let's bring on our guest interviewer tonight, Brother McCormick. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you both for letting me be a part of the conversation.
Man, it's great to have you. It's great to have you. You really this after this episode, you'll be certified as a co-host. I don't know if I told you.
Don't start charging me rent.
It's
brother
due
here
on
all
the
the
15th.
time. You have one of those friends that like would come by and like never go home.
Hey, don't remind me, man. That traumatized me so much. I went about 30 years and didn't want folks to come by my house because I'm like, okay, because when they come over, it's hard to get folks to leave. But you are welcome eternally in our fellowship, and I'm so glad to have you. I don't know if Linda, well, she didn't get to hear that. Was a conversation in the background. Linda, if you're watching, Mark mentioned that he had a chance to actually interview Muhammad Ali in his home. Linda in his mom's home.
Yeah.
Linda has a very it's a funny observation about Mark, Kyle. She says that is the most interesting guy.
Yeah, interesting is an interesting way of describing people.
I mean, yeah, when people say that, that means that they are like curious.
It's interesting.
You're arousing curiosity. But she says she's never seen anyone who has met so many people and had so many like interesting stories. And it's true though. But that I think we all have amazing stories. What's different about Mark McCormick, and that's why I'm glad you're doing this interview tonight. What's different about you is that you have an uncanny ability to pay attention to life and stories and people in a way, and to gather those stories and hold on to them. I think we all experience amazing things day in, day out, but they pass in and pass out quickly, but you hold on to them in a way, and you're able to find meaning and depth in those in ordinary events, and pay attention to everything. But thank you for coming on. How are you?
Oh, I'm well. I just wanted to say one thing real quick. At my old church back in Kentucky, one of the ministries was, Afrocentric lifestyles. And so you could take on a new name. And one of the names that I had chosen for myself was Talib, because Talib actually means seeker.
Wow.
And I've shared with you that if I had my druthers, I'd be in school the rest of my life, because I like learning. And that's really what you get from me, is like, I'm excited about learning things. I'm kind of a nerd about these kinds of things. So you appreciate that here. It's not appreciated everywhere.
It's not. It is not. I think that's true of both me, you, and Kyle. Actually, I think that's part of the connection, is that we are like these eternal learners with this eternal curiosity, and who could enjoy being in school forever.
Oh yeah.
And you're right. That is not always appreciated, because sometimes I carry that into the pulpit and other place, which I shouldn't, because there's a place for that. And sometimes I get so into it that I want to carry it into my teaching and preaching, and that's not, that's a different thing you're doing. And that doesn't mean people can't learn from teaching and preaching. Of course they want to learn and grow and expand, but that can't be your focus when you go. That can't be your Kyle. I think that's part of what happens when folks talk about it takes what Kyle could preach in like 12 15 minutes, what it takes me 45 minutes. I think because it takes, like, I'm doing all this other stuff, and then maybe the last 10 minutes I finally get to the point, and they're like, okay, like, why didn't it take it?
Now, I'm afraid that the people of St. Mark have this impression of me preaching 10, 12-minute sermons every week. So, yeah, I only do it for you, Robert.
Hey, thank you for saying that. So, St. Mark, don't go running over to the journey. Don't leave us. Go run over to the journey. You can go visit, but don't leave us.
They'd visit the journey and be like, wait, this is just like Robert does. Ah, man, we can't get away from it.
Exactly.
He can't get to his point either.
Exactly. And on another conversation, we're going to have a conversation about geography and how it impacts, how it shapes faith. I've been watching. The TV thing that I'm into now, besides the NBA playoffs, is a documentary on the Smithsonian channel called Aerial America, and it like goes from state to state, and it tells a story of that. Now I think it's a little outdated because it's some of the comments they make from about 10, 12, 15 years ago.
Huh.
But I just saw one on Minnesota, which was fascinating.
Hmm.
It would be great to have a conversation, Mark and Kyle, one evening about geography and about location and how that shapes one's life and shapes one's faith journey, even.
Mm.
So I look forward to that. But thank you all for being on. Let's jump into our conversation. So, folks, I've asked Kyle and Mark to do an interview with me of sorts. I am celebrating the 1 year anniversary of the release of my first book, Jesus Unchained, published through Invite Resources. Very excited about Invite Resources. Their author base is really growing. They've done some stuff now with Lynn Sweet and some other folks. They've got a book called Dynamite Prayer that's on the bestsellers list that's doing very well. That's sold over 5,000 copies since released. And so we're working on another manuscript called Kingdom Moments and Movements should be released in January, and doing some other stuff. And then there's the initial idea of an anthology that is going to include several authors. So I'm very excited about Invite Resources. Grateful for them for publishing this book, my first book for me, and we're celebrating the 1 year anniversary. So I thought I would come on. I don't want to talk about the book so much. I want to talk about what the book's about. So we're not trying to push the book. But the contents of the book are very important to me. And so under the topic of, is Jesus still relevant, or how telling the truth about Jesus can change the world? So prepare yourself. Those of you that like more thoughtful consideration of Jesus and faith, you will probably enjoy this a little more than some others. But those of you that like more devotional approach to faith, stay tuned in, because we'll try to plan as much of that in our conversation as possible. Thank you all for watching. And hello, Mom. My mom said hello, Mark and Kyle. She comes on. And so she said hello to everyone. Those of you others that are watching, if you're on, say Cheryl Stevenson. We did see you as well. Thank you, Cheryl, for coming on. Cheryl came on just to thank Nichelle. Notice that she didn't come on and say, hey, hi, Kyle and Mark. She just said. But hello, Cheryl. Thank you for watching. If you're watching right now, reach out to some folks, share this on your page. Mark, let's get started with our conversation.
All right. Well, I'm eager to get into the conversation, but can you talk first about some changes that are coming to St. Mark?
Yes. So St. Mark is getting a new pastor. That's the first thing I want to say. The Dr. Victor McCullough, who is currently a district superintendent in the Oklahoma Conference of the United Methodist Church, has been serving in that role for a few years, and he is coming to serve as senior pastor at St. Mark. Dr. McCullough he was at St. Mark for about a year or two under Tyrone Gordon. I think he served as executive pastor, and he's coming back. But this time he's coming back having served several churches and done an outstanding job, having served as a district superintendent. His wife is a prayer warrior, Nancy at St. Mark. If you all remember his wife, prayer warrior, they're coming back, and he will lead St. Mark. I'm very excited about his seasoned leadership. St. Mark is still fragile. We've been through a lot of changes. We've come through the pandemic. New staff, a lot of new people are coming in, and so that we need seasoned leadership, and that's what we're getting in Dr. Victor McCullough. So St. Mark, start praying for him. Start preparing yourself to help lead the church and help serve people, so that we let's not bring him in and treat him like he's got to save us. We've got to save ourselves. But God has given us a great leader to do that. And then I will be going over to 2.5 hours over to Leawood, Kansas, to serve as main campus pastor for Church of the Resurrection. They now call themselves Resurrection, by the way. They've changed. They've done some rebranding. It's no longer Church of the Resurrection. They just call themselves Resurrection, a United Methodist Church. It's the largest church in the United Methodist Church in the world. They have a membership of about 30,000. They have 6 campuses. Their plan is to have 10 campuses. and I will serve as pastor of the main campus. Part of what they're doing is part of what we talk about on Ignite is they are trying to expand diversity. They are a very progressive church in many ways, but they're a very mixed church. They have people across the political spectrum, but they are trying to expand diversity, find new ways of doing ministry. They love what we do here with Ignite and want to see some of that leadership at that main campus. So we're very excited about that. Linda and I are house hunting in the area. We'll be closer to my friend Mark McCormick. Can't wait for that fellowship, and Mark Dupree as well. Looking forward
I'm
to
just saying, if you're worried about me being at the house all the time now, like, oh, here he is again.
Come. So we're looking forward to that. But Wichita, I want St. Mark and Wichita to know that I'm still in Kansas. So that's one thing. So all the work I'm doing, Pastor Kyle, with Kifa, with Topeka Jump, and with state agencies that are working on justice issues, I will be still be involved with those. We're still going to be a part of helping to make Nehemiah Village happen. That's our housing project for returning citizens, and still contributing to the Wichita community in multiple ways. I've even had some immediate conversations with some folks over at the Kansas Leadership Center about how we can work together to expand the reach of the Kansas Leadership Center to other locations. So very excited about that. We've moved around. My wife and I, we realized, looking, but we didn't intend it this way. So let me not pretend like but it just so happens after 25 years of full-time ministry, I've moved around and gone, and not just moved. Methodist preachers move around, but we've moved around to states and cities and done that, and in every place we've served, we've done kind of what I call an apostolic work, which either rebuilding or building or planting or developing, that kind of thing. And so my guess is that I'll end up doing some of that kind of work with Resurrection, which is very exciting.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So I really wanted to launch in, but I've been reading your book for a while.
Yeah.
And I put it down, and then we talked about tonight's discussion. I went through it again.
Yeah.
And this might seem strange, Rev, but it reminded me of a play I heard a lot about back in the 80s called Woza Albert.
Wow, haven't heard of that. Wow.
It's a play that was written by two South Africans in the 80s, in the era of apartheid in South Africa. It was about Jesus returning to South Africa during apartheid.
Wow.
And the fact that when Jesus returned, he was not what the ruling class was wanting or expecting. In fact, I can tell you this without giving away the play, but he's crucified.
Yeah.
In South Africa.
Again.
And it's about the interpretation. I'd shared with you before when I was a weekend reporter in Kentucky. Muhammad Ali would make these surprise appearances, and we'd run out and cover it. And I covered an event at a school where he started shadowboxing with a child, and it frightened the child because the champ's hands are literally like fists.
Wow.
And it was intimidating to me, but imagine how it would look to a child, right? So he invited the kids over to his mom's house, right? He baked them a cake. He did a magic show for them. And then after they left, I dropped all sort of journalistic decorum and said, "Oh, you're my hero, champ." And and I said, "But I'm the only reporter on, so I got to go." And I gave him the greeting, "Assalamu alaikum." And he said, "So you're a Muslim?" I was like, "No, I'm a Christian." And he said, "Wait right here." He went and got the Bible and the Quran, and we sat there for another hour while he tried to convert me. And he was reading me these scriptures, and he was like, "Well, the scriptures don't line up perfectly, but the Quran is the same as it was when Muhammad brought it back from the mountain."
Wow.
So that was like his interpretation.
Wow.
And isn't all religion really about interpretation? And is that what led you to write this book?
Look at our friend Paul James, who just let's bring him on as I'm answering your question. Wow, here it is.
My man, Paul.
Hey, it doesn't get any better than this. My three favorite people, three people who stimulate me intellectually and spiritually and as a human being. So this is heaven for me.
Well, that brother's chair is still smoking from his last appearance.
I know. So,
but isn't it all about interpretation?
Absolutely. And not only is it about interpretation, but what Pastor Kyle and I will tell you, so much of what we think is orthodoxy is a matter of who controlled the narrative. Mm-hmm. So the powers that be, they get to tell they get to say what narrative gets told. They get to wipe out the competing narratives. They suppress narratives. So one of the things that I learned very early in my theological studies, for example, was, and it's right there, you can see it, but in all the ways that the voices of women are suppressed in the Christian tradition, in the Christian story, even in like, for example, there's a passage in Luke 8, I believe, Pastor Kyle, where it says Jesus, his disciples were following him, and it says there were also a large company of women. In other words, it sounds like he had more late women as disciples than he had men. Now you had the 12, but there was a large company of women who were part of his school of discipleship. And that kind of totally gets suppressed, both in scripture, which scriptures get chosen, and then in the following tradition, literature of Christians, what's the narratives that get told. So it's always about interpretation. Now, having said that, does that mean that I believe that there are that some interpretations are more legitimate, are more valid than others? Of course, I believe that. Does that mean that I don't have some core convictions about what I believe to be the right interpretations about certain stuff? Of course, I have that. But I also understand, though, that the fact that I have to fight for those convictions reflects the fact that there are competing interpretations. Absolutely.
So, there's a praxis, how things are practiced, and then there's the orthodoxy, right?
Right.
When you were writing your book, is that where you were putting this discussion about there's a narrative about Christianity, and then there's Jesus the Christ, and you're trying to move people from a narrative to the actual person, and it's applicable because, in our society, like I did a fellowship a couple years ago, and the entire fellowship was about how narratives have become more powerful than actual facts.
Absolutely.
And that the way our brains accept information,
absolutely,
lean toward narratives. And that if we're presented with facts that don't fit the narrative, we'll reject those because absolutely, the narrative is more important. Is that what you have found with your book?
Yes, absolutely. And I will tell you, Mark, you see that is exactly. So let me start on a secular social level. That is exactly what's happening with this whole thing. And I hate to use the term CRT, because what CRT is most folks don't even have a clue. That is a graduate curriculum that most people wouldn't. But that term is being used to address the issue of how we tell American history. So there is a battle over narrative that's happening right now.
Yeah.
Like, what narrative will we allow to happen in our schools?
That's
and
why.
Again, go ahead, Kyle. Yes.
Brian Stevenson says the North won the Civil War and the South won the narrative war.
Exactly. That's right.
Well, yeah, you're talking about Alfred Pollard and the Lost Cause.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, so narratives are absolutely powerful.
Absolutely powerful. Now, and I don't know if he did this intentionally or this is just a reflection of his character and how he goes about. But in our lifetime, one of the public persons who gets that is Donald Trump. Donald Trump understands that narrative matters more to people than facts. Like if you can control the narrative and if you can repeat your narrative and you can get your narrative out there, most people aren't going to do the hard work to get the facts. Okay. And the more emotional you can make your narrative, or the more you can connect your narrative to emotional being, the more powerful it becomes. And so it is about the narrative. So another perspective on that, Mark. Pastor Kyle and I learned, and Mark, Paul has probably run across this some too, what we call liberation theology.
Oh, yeah.
Now, those of you that are watching, if you've heard liberation theology and you didn't like it, don't run away. I'm not about to give this grand endorsement of liberation theology, although, that's not what I'm doing right now. My point is that liberation theology begins from this assertion that history and theology has been done from the victors of history, by the victors of history and the oppressors of history, and that we have not heard the story and we have not understood the theology of people from what they call the underside of history.
Mm.
Right.
But the narratives, Rev, are the chains on Jesus, right?
Yes. Absolutely. The narratives become the vehicles through which what I call idolatries. So people have idolatries, whether that be, your political posture, your race, whatever, and then narratives get wrapped around that idolatry to give them power.
Mm-hmm.
So yes.
So
Does that make sense?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Is that why you're so focused relentlessly on Jesus, the man?
So the reason I do that is more an internal Christian battle. So what has happened from my perspective and within the church, Christendom, is that there is this focus on Jesus as this spiritual, divine, otherworldly being who also is only concerned about the spiritual part of human beings. And so there's an over spiritualization of who Jesus is and an over spiritualization of what Jesus was about. Well, okay, well then when that happens, what's being missed? His humanity, the humanity of people that Jesus wants to bless, and the humanity of the dynamics that got created when Jesus was on earth. So a good friend of mine, is a very dear friend of mine, and we're having this soft debate back and forth about was Jesus political. And I agree that Jesus was not explicitly political, but just the fact that he showed up and who he hung out with in his day and time was a political, it impacted the political reality. So in Jesus' community, where there was a union of state and church, and to some sense, the religious leaders were in union with the Roman, that if you hung out with a prostitute, that wasn't just a religious that wasn't a religious act, that was a political act.
And a social scandal.
Right. So Jesus didn't have to be explicitly political because of his radical love, his radical sense of justice, his radical affirmation of all human beings. That is political for many people. So let me give an example. If I go to a predominantly conservative white church, okay, a Christian church that says you can't be a Christian if you don't support Donald Trump, that kind of church. If I go to that church and I say, I think we need to be involved with helping the Black people, the black infant mortality rate in the 67214 zip code, that's going to be immediately interpreted as a political statement. He's trying to do politics. He's trying to do race baiting, because to care for certain people in a particular context for some people is to be political.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that was the criticism of Dr. King. He just loved poor people to the point where he started talking about social programs and the way that the war took from social programs and programs of social uplift and made him dangerous.
Right.
Made him a dangerous person.
It makes you dangerous.
But this topic is really interesting to me. Go ahead.
And then hold on to that question.
Sure,
I want to show you another dynamic. The same thing happens, Mark. So let's just take at St. Mark. Let's take out a local church, especially being a person who's not from Wichita. And if I walk into a room at St. Mark and everybody in that room, they're all from Wichita. There are pre-made, a priori allegiances in that room because of people who have known each other. And if I walk into that room and I affirm a particular person, for many people in that room, that is a political. I mean, they wouldn't. It's not political. When I say political, I mean control. Who has power?
Mm-hmm.
I am. That is a power game for some people. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does.
Because if there are competing rivalries in that room, if I affirm one of those rivalries, one of those parties, the other parties are going to see that as a threat. So it's the same dynamic that gets played out in a local church, that gets played out in Christendom at large, gets played out in national and global politics. Yeah.
But the point of your book about are we following the real Jesus?
Yeah.
It's always been an interesting topic to me. I can remember hearing a sermon, and this was when lots of churches were creating Afrocentric lifestyle ministries, and they were practicing liberation theology. And I remember a minister saying once that unless you come from a nationalist, Pan-African perspective, the Christianity that you're practicing as a Black person doesn't really mean anything, because you're not really following the real Jesus. Is that an issue that you take up in your book? And if so, how? And if not, why not?
So in my book, what I do with that is I embrace Jesus as a global reality, as a global person, that he cannot be owned by somebody on the basis of race, ethnicity, or anything else. In the same way that the Jews could not own him. He was a Jew. He was born and raised. As a matter of fact, in my reading, Jesus never was intending to start a new religion. He was reinterpreting his own faith. He died. But they could not own him in the same way that I can't claim ownership of him as a Black person or as an African or as a European. We can't claim, and but at the same time, we do have to interpret him in our contexts. So in some ways, we have to dress him in our own clothes, if that makes sense. So it's like, if he comes to my community, in order for the people in my community to be able to connect with him and find identity with him, in some sense, he has to become like us. That's exactly what the theology of incarnation is about, is God becoming one of us so that we might better understand who God is. So in the same way, Jesus has to be reinterpreted in different contexts. So that has to happen. I talk about that in the book, about how we all have to do the work of interpretation and contextualization. Mm-hmm. But we have to always do that with the sense of humility, in the sense that we don't own Jesus. And that in our attempt to make him relevant for our community, we have to always remember that Jesus is always for the other.
Well, that humility is important, because
it's huge.
It's a big deal to try and interpret the most important person the life of the most important person who ever walked the earth. Yeah. It's a tall task. Is that why it took you so long to get the book out of you? You said you wrestled with it for years. For years, because I was evolving, and every time I thought I got to a place of thorough understanding, I'd have new experiences and new insights. New things were happening in our social and political context and so finally, I just got to a place that it was the 2020 election cycle that really kind of finished pushing the book out. Because I saw in the country I love, Mark, Kyle, in the country I love,
in the part of the country that I love. I've lived in the deep South, the Southwest, and the Midwest. That I saw Jesus being owned by communities in a way that it became oppressive to others. In other words, it's like and let me just give an example. I like bombs. I've gathered all the other people who like bombs too. And now we're going to paint Jesus on all of our bombs. And by the way, the Jesus we paint on our bombs is the Jesus, and he looks just like us. So it was this, and Kyle probably has language to, I'm sure there's some theological language where there's a convergence, Kyle, of faith, politics, and culture in a way that it becomes oppressive, exclusive in a very unhealthy way, right? I saw that happening, and I felt the need to bear witness to say, no, that is not who Jesus is.
Yeah, the term is Christian nationalism. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, and it's where we have co-opted Jesus for our own political and national. We think we love Jesus and we add America, but what we really do is we love America and we add Jesus.
Exactly.
That is interesting.
Exactly.
That is really interesting. So I want to stay here for just a little bit. So what was this process like? Was it painful as you're trying to reconcile what you were really feeling? Did it test your faith? Did you question your faith as a part of this wrestling match that you were, the spiritual wrestling match that you were a part of?
Yeah, that was a deep. As I wrote this book and did the editing, I will include the editing phase as well. There was a kind of spiritual warfare that happened with it, and I don't mean against anybody else. I meant internally, in the sense that I realized that there was a lot of, and I'll own it. There was a lot of anger that came out in that first draft. And my publisher, my editor came to me and said, Robert, she says, there's some strong stuff here. And she says, and actually, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. She says, but my concern is that if we say it the way you're saying it, then we won't give people a chance to even read the book, because they're going to
give us a whiff of that. I'm intrigued.
Give us some of your anger, Robert.
A reporter is always going to go right to the place maybe you don't want to go. But that's intriguing to me, because it's something that everybody who is really on a walk of faith, it's something that everybody can relate to, where you're beginning to question things and you're asking for answers. So how much of that can you tell without giving away too much of the book?
Well, a lot of that had to do with, so what I saw in what was happening politically in our country was a return of what has happened multiple times in our country. And so it's what happened when I understand the fact that people left another country and came here in the name of religious freedom. And then as they were creating religious freedom for themselves and freedom for themselves, they were enslaving other people. So, the moment that it hit me, that I came to the realization that it wasn't like, okay, there were a group of Christians, European Christians who came, and then there were these other people who were into slavery. And these are two different groups of people. And that the Christians allowed these people to create slavery. No, those were the same people. So the same people who left and were seeking religious freedom, who were in love with God, were also the people who built churches and built communities, and then started engaging in the slave trade. So from that to every time there's been Black progress in America, there's always been a backlash. We can talk about Reconstruction. So one of the most progressive time politically in our country for African Americans was post-slavery, during the period of Reconstruction. Then you get post-Reconstruction, where you get this backlash, particularly in my part of where I was born and raised in the Deep South, there was this horrible backlash where they were, and watch this, the Christians, the white Americans in the South, in the name of being Christian, started burning churches.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see that movie Mississippi Burning, that's not just a movie. Like that was a part of what they call the Southern terrorism against black people, both to take away, to frighten them from, because they had the political progress in Reconstruction was so great that they wanted to frighten them away from the polls. So they started engaging in this terrorism, lynching and terrorism to frighten black folks away from the polls. And that happened, and it was done by Christians. So when you talk about the KKK started, those folks considered themselves Christians. And when I say that, some of my white friends don't, and so there's a picture in the book that I use. There's a gathering of the KKK, right? And they're in a church. So again, it's a gathering, and they're dressed in their garb, okay? So they're dressed in their garb, and they're in a church. And above them is a big sign that says, Jesus saves. Wow. I mean, can you get like what that does to the psyche, the illiterate psyche of folks in the KKK? And then what does that do to the psyche of black slaves and black folks living in the South, that this connection is being made? And so how that creates this mental and spiritual reality that black folks have struggled against. So Kyle, I felt that I saw that same resurgence happening in reaction to the election of a black man for president. I saw the same backlash happening, and Jesus was being used big time. I mean, there were people that were given prophecy that God told them that Donald Trump was a righteous man. I hate man. I did not intend to call his name. I didn't, because this is not, those of you that are Trump fan, I'm not getting into, we're not letting Donald Trump my conversation about Jesus. But that people were making those kind of affirmations about him, and the same people were saying that Barack Obama was a demon, was a devil. And I'm like, okay, as far as
the devil would be attractive,
right?
That's why he was so attractive, right?
That's why he was so attractive.
Yeah.
They go in the White House, and the White House smelled like sulfur, which was a sign. The smell of sulfur is supposed to be a sign of demonic presence. All these calling his wife gorilla, and I'm like, okay, as far as other than Jimmy Carter, this man, no scandals, no extramarital affairs. Always responding to meanness with kindness, always trying to build a bridge, always trying to find a way to talk with fairness and balance. And yet at every turn, he was demonized and hated and despised. And other than healthcare thing that happened in his first 2 years before the Senate and the Congress, before those got taken back over by the conservatives, he passed that, but he didn't get anything else really done. But he was hated so deeply. And you tell a story about how you were in West Wichita and you were in a drive-through at McDonald's, and somebody
those were the calls that I got the day after the election.
Yeah.
Did you want me to recount that?
Yeah, recount that.
So the day after the election, my phone was just ringing off the hook. And the first call was people coming through a McDonald's drive-through at 13th and West Street. And they were saying, I don't want any N-words touching my money or my food, to the point where the little girl at the drive-through was just bawling. They had to send her home. The second call was from a teacher who'd had lunch with the same group of teachers for 10 years. They left her for the first time in 10 years. And then stopped speaking to her, wouldn't give her an explanation. Then the last call was a grandmother who said her grandchild came home from school crying because the kids wouldn't play with her because we had an N-word president.
Wow.
And again, these are Christians, and I'm getting a sense for where your anger was. So here you are, a pastor, and you're trying to be a follower of Christ. You want to love these children of Christ. Right. You know, he
But
wasn't
are they?
any kind of creative malfeasance when he created these folk, right? I can see where the anger came from.
Right.
What did you want to say, Paul?
But are they really Christians, or is Christianity being used as a tool to prop up nation state formations?
Absolutely, Paul. That's the latter.
This is we've got to be able to identify evil and not allow it to be labeled by what I call the corruption of righteous terms and righteous possibilities.
Yeah.
You see it with all organized religions. By nature, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism these aren't bad practices or theories or revelations, nor are those terms bad. However, it's people who use them
Right.
to promote imperialism and colonialism and patriarchy.
Yes.
And racism and class.
Yep.
I think we have to be sensitive to how we give these terms to people so liberally, who show the exact opposite of the true character of those historical faiths.
That's
I hope
exactly.
I'm making sense. That sounds a little bit nerdy.
No. That's no. I love that.
I
Thank
feel
you.
that, and it's
Absolutely.
it has so much impact, Paul, because we live in a country that hates poor people.
Right.
We punish poverty. At any given time in this state, we have 6,000 people sitting in jail for no other reason other than they don't have bail. They haven't been convicted of anything. They simply do not have the money for it. And these systems exist because there's no hue and cry from the people that police and prosecutors answer to.
Right.
If there were, the system would change.
Right.
But it's really unjust to treat people worse because they're poor and innocent than to treat them well, as Pastor Kyle was saying earlier about Brian Stevenson, that in this country you're treated better if you're rich and guilty, than if you're poor and innocent.
Right.
And Paul was like right on point with a question that I had,
Yeah.
which was, essentially the way we interpret Christianity, couldn't that just be about an exercise of power? That
Absolutely.
wherever you have this kind of power in the hands of human beings, people are going to misuse it.
Absolutely. And that connects us. That's part of the reason Pastor Kyle and I, that's one that I'm holding him close at, because he's doing some phenomenal thinking about power and how that gets played out. We had a phenomenal conversation last Wednesday with a guy by the name of Ben McConnell, who works with DART, about power, because that's and so what do you do? So then the question is, so some people in the Christendom feel like they have no power. Some people in Christendom have given up their power because they've misinterpreted the Bible to mean that to be humble means to give up power, which is because you can't. How you're not humble if you don't have power anyway. I mean, if you can't knock somebody's head off, it's like you're not humble saying I'm not going to knock your head off, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's only the person who can knock your head off who chooses not to. That's the. But then Pastor Kyle is doing this thing where he's talking about how we use power as a privilege for the sake of others, and that is what we have not seen in Christendom. What people have done with power is that they've used power and then corrupted the language, taken over the narrative, taken over the theology, Paul, and redesigned them to hold on to power.
I would say what we have not seen in Christendom since 313 AD, when
that's right,
when Christianity merged with the political powers.
Yeah.
Prior to that, we saw wonderful uses of Christians using their power to empower others and to for the flourishing of others. But once we grabbed hold of political power over others, we've gotten lots of very, very poor examples of Christianity after that.
Been a very different dynamic.
Paul,
Mark, you all know what he's referring to, right?
Well, I was asking, this is about the Protestant Reformation, right?
Well,
no. When Constantine, the Emperor of Rome, became a Christian, whether he did or didn't, whether it was for political purposes or not, is in 313, and recognized Christianity as a legal religion, and then later as the formal religion of Rome, of the Roman Empire. It was after that Augustine started writing about just war theory and things like that, and then on into, especially into the Middle Ages, when Christianity and the political empires were merged in incredibly awful ways, and power became even worse within Christianity.
I think, gentlemen, that I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, go in, Paul. Yeah, jump in, Paul.
I think there is one escape that Christians are going to have to continue to wrestle with, and I can say this as a historian, that has turned the world upside down. And I'm going to put it in a geopolitical framework.
Okay.
And that is when Christianity decided to colonize the racialized image of God.
Yes.
Let me repeat that. When Christianity decided to colonize the racial identity of a creator to meet the needs of a third of the Earth's population that we call European, that put the world in motion, in what I call direct line with decay.
Mm-hmm.
Because anybody who follows that faith and the principles of that faith have to do so knowing that at the end of the day, if you are not a part of that racial caste that we call European, you are in fact secondary,
second class,
in the eyesight.
That's right.
Of God.
That's exactly right.
And so what makes that so brutal is that very colonization is in direct contradiction to the historical man who walked in Southwest Asia 2,000 years ago. This is very dangerous, gentlemen.
Absolutely.
Now, what even makes it more dangerous is we should not be spending our time talking about skin color preference and privilege.
We shouldn't even be talking about it. Exactly.
But because a decision was made that we must colonize Mary's son and the image of her son, boy, that has caused so much pain, destruction, spiritual decay. And I'm going to say both in terms of the politics of faith, but also the nationality of faith,
the spirituality of faith. Because
can I add something to that?
Yes, absolutely.
As always, Paul is just really bringing it. So a pastor that I remain friends with, a man named Clay Calloway, he was an assistant pastor at my church in Kentucky. And, every now and then he got to preach. And his sermon one Sunday has stayed with me for all these years. And he talked about growing up in church, singing those songs about being washed white as snow as a black person. He could never quite reconcile that. And so in his sermon, he said that the blood of Christ was really more like Clorox 2. Brightens whites and brightens colors. But it speaks precisely to what Paul was saying, that if Christ is not, if I am not in Christ's image, then where am I?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the Erykah Badu song years ago. She said, if we were made in his image, then call us by our names.
Right. Right.
Wow.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. So Paul, I'll make a statement in the book, as a matter of fact, that I talk about the whole of the white Jesus and kind of hint at the profound damage that is done that people don't even begin to understand. And then that it's become a deep idol. So just a moment of and I'll plug into some spiritual dimension here. And I don't know if Kyle will agree with this. I think in my experience as a human being and as a pastor, when an idol gets set up in the human heart, so an idol means that there's something that I give higher value and place as a higher authority in my life than my creator. And that distorts and I believe that fundamentally distorts my humanity. That when that happens, that is the first step, Kyle, into, now I'm not talking about the Exorcist the movie. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff, but this kind of dark demonic influence that can take over one's life. And then you see all kinds of perversions. So not only do you paint Jesus white, but then you become offended. You have a righteous indignation at the thought that somebody would paint him with dark skin. Yeah, like look how perverted that is. So number one is that you perverted him in the first place and made him a white European, but then now you are offended that somebody suggests that he was black, or that he was.
I mean, Robert, what kind of problems does this interpretation create for an African American man?
Exactly.
In a church that is trying to expand beyond white communities, black communities, but trying to bring people together.
It's
when
devastating.
The foundation of a belief system has been sort of co-opted by people who believe in white nationalism, as Pastor Kyle was saying before. Exactly. What kind of problems does this create for you and for this and for the audience of the book? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. So what I say, and I don't spend a lot of time on it in the book, because basically what I say, as Paul says, race shouldn't matter. And I was like, and it doesn't unless it does. Right? So it doesn't matter unless it does. Now, if it matters, then it does matter. It does matter. And because we can't even begin to fathom the depth of perversion and demonic destruction that has happened in the psyche and souls of Black folks to have to deal with
Black folks and white folks, because I think that's part of where my mind went too, is that because it wasn't merely Black Americans that needed to be set free in slavery. It was white Americans who were chained to a narrative that was ultimately destructive to them as well.
That's right.
in a very different way, obviously, but their souls were being destroyed in their destroying the souls of others.
Yeah,
such a great point, Pastor Kyle. I'd be interested in what Paul has to say about this, but one of my favorite historians is Taylor Branch.
Yes,
he talks about how the civil rights movement liberated lots of folks that aren't typically given any attention. For instance, after the Public Accommodations Law passed and the Voting Rights Act passed, President Johnson went after immigration. And for a long time, we only allowed immigration from maybe 3 or 4 Northern European countries. But after that, the door just kind of opened for other people. And to your point, Pastor Kyle, he talked about how the movement broke what he called, quote, a grand circle of fear, where we were all just kind of in a circle, fearful of one another. And it led to the opening up of the Sun Belt and actually Atlanta getting a baseball team. They didn't have a place to put the baseball team, but they got the Braves from Milwaukee moved to Atlanta, and suddenly their economy everything that they rely on now as a destination for vacationers has been made possible by the breaking of this grand circle of fear.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Response to that, Paul?
I think we have to be careful when we are mixing so many different conversations. Our heart is in the right place when we do that. But let's just be honest. People who are classified as whites wanted to set up a new nation for them. That sounds very brutal, but that's brutally honest. And they stopped at nothing, including using the Christ figure to create a docile second-class citizenship, i.e. Native Americans, i.e. Black folk. But we can't lose sight that their intentions was to set up a nation state based on their survival in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah. And they've done that successfully. Yeah. Now what we're trying to do is trying to undo and uncover those layers of trauma. Yeah. Now, Pastor Cal, I agree with you that as whites set out to create a new nation, they destroyed others, but in turn was also destroying themselves. Yeah. I think that's a beautiful conversation within white cultures and white circles. Yeah. I think we need more white folk, brothers and sisters, in quotes, talking about these issues that are related to skin color and asking hard questions such as, what have we done? What are we doing? And how can we produce more of a John Brown spirit? I'm going to call on John Brown here now, because this is very important for the listeners and the viewers to understand what I'm about to say. Gentlemen, I spent 26 years doing diversity work at an institutional level. Now, I want you to listen to what I'm about to say very carefully. I met many white people who were trying to understand the concept of racism. But I met few white people who were trying to undo racism.
Wow.
Sort of like what Ibram X. Kendi is trying to do with his book. Is that what you mean, Paul? How to be an anti-racist?
I'm going to say that, and how to promote a system of human equity in the absence of recognizing skin color difference.
Wow.
If what I'm saying is true, I just made a bold statement. 26 years in diversity and equity management at the institutional level. Predominantly white institutions, mind you. I met few white people that would get in what I call racialized harm's way. But I met thousands who was willing to go to conferences, sit in meetings, read books, and watch videos related to understanding this concept of race. So for me, there's a spirit here in talking about the Christ figure. How do we replicate, maybe not as violent, but a John Brown spirit of overthrowing this consciousness that skin color somehow matters at day's end? As African-centered as I am, and as African-centered as I will never give up, that doesn't give me the license to trample on other humans and other parts of humanity that don't share that phenotype with me.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's where and that's why. So, and Paul, thank you for saying, because that's where I ended up with the book. Because I got to a place where I said that like as much as I want to embrace my own blackness, my identity, my Southern blackness, as a matter of fact, as a black man who was born and raised in the South. As much as I embrace that and I'm proud of that, that my goal then is to be a participant in what I believe Jesus was doing, and that was the affirmation of all human beings beyond race, ethnicity. And I think that's what he was doing, and that's where I want to end up. So in order to end up there, then I can't pursue, as I address the issues, including the issue of racism. There are many others. There are issues that are within the church. As I address, is I can't embrace those in a way that I decide to demonize an entire group of people because of their current stance. But it's how do I help be a force to move us forward beyond race and beyond class division to the affirmation of all people. And then, Mark, that gets into, because I think that the most important thing I do in the book, is like say, so Paul, I deal with the historical. Now, when I say the historical Jesus, I mean the Jesus as recorded in Gospels, okay? Because I know there are questions among people, and I'm just, for those who are listening who've never heard this, I want to be very careful that there are people. Well, but you need to know this. You need to know that there are people in the world that doubt even that Jesus ever existed, based upon Roman historical records, so forth and so on. But when I say historic, I mean the story that's recorded in the narrative, that they're radical, powerful, human affirming stories there, right? So like who Jesus sides with, and how he never allows one person to come to him to talk about another person, that whoever comes to him, you become the target of his spiritual surgery, right? It becomes just amazing things that he does through that are so human that to me. And so I don't like, even though I can affirm my belief in the divinity of Christ and all of that supernatural other world, I can affirm that. But I don't like that we get so caught up in that, because I think a lot of times that's an escape from the Jesus, the human being whose life we get some picture of in the Gospels, because it is a radical life that can radically change how we view humanity, how we view each other. And so I think the sickness of the church is that we have lost touch with not the divinity of Jesus, but we've lost touch with the humanity of Jesus, and that we don't even understand our own humanity, and that the church, the place where people a faith community where people are supposed to be able to get in touch with their humanity and come alive as the crown of God's creation. In many cases, it is the last place where you go, and it is the place where people feel less human than any other time of the week.
Oh, wow.
You can have people sit in a worship service and sing the songs and hear a sermon and never come alive, never feel alive, never feel deep connection with what's going on, but they did church. And I think that that's pervasive in many. That's my fundamental assertion in the whole in the book.
Yeah, the divinity of Christ
Bye,
so
Paul.
often. Oh,
Thanks
thank
for
you,
joining
Paul.
us.
My
Thank you,
brother,
Professor.
love you, Paul. Love you. Yeah, Kyle, keep going. Yeah.
What you're saying about the divinity of Christ versus the incarnation of Christ, though I mean, obviously we're not setting those against each other, but recognizing that especially modern American Christianity has so overemphasized the divinity of Christ. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we're just our sense of spirituality is so tied to like Jesus gets me into heaven,
Right.
and that's the whole thing. And yet, so if that was the case, then the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could really just be the last few chapters of each of those books. But the authors spend like an incredible amount of time pointing out Jesus was born and he lived all these experiences. And there's this quote from N.T. Wright. He kind of critiques the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, and then suffered and died. And he imagines the gospel writers sitting there like, we spent a whole lot of time talking about all the things he did, and you just skipped over all of that.
Skipped over all of that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
And we really do need to embrace the incarnation of Jesus, and that he what we refer to as the gospel according to Matthew is so the gospel, and Scott McKnight talks a lot about this. The gospel is not the four spiritual laws or the Romans road. The gospel is not what little thing I say to somebody to try to get them to accept Jesus. The gospel is Jesus. The gospel is the story of Jesus. It's the whole story of Jesus. And we try to funnel it into like a 3-point conversation with somebody, trying to evangelize to them and get them to make a decision so they can go to heaven. Anyway, that's my soapbox.
No.
All that to say, I think absolutely 100%.
I
just
totally
had
agree with you.
2 more quick questions, and I know we're at a time boundary.
Okay.
But you were talking about, how the image of Christ has done a lot of damage. I feel like, and I'd love to hear what each of you have to say about this, but I've really been bothered over the years by this kind of Christianity that is pushing prosperity.
Yeah.
It's all about money. God wants you to be rich. That has really bothered me, and I feel like it's sort of it's a natural and predictable upshot in a country, as I said, that worships money and hates poor people. The second question has to do with something that Paul said, which made me wonder, if you have people hurt by the image, people who don't fit that image, and then people who feel like that was the image I created for myself to make myself superior, then you have 2 different kinds of hurt. How do you handle both hurts under one church roof?
Wow.
How do you, isn't that the big challenge?
Yeah.
If we're going to worship together, how do we make sure that we're offering triage and the right triage to people who are hurting, but in different ways?
So two great questions. So I'll speak to the first question in terms of what was the first question?
The prosperity
gospel.
Yeah.
So the prosperity. So yeah. So I think the prosperity gospel is a result of excessive individualism in America. So that's number one. And then you combine that with materialism. So individualism and materialism, and it gets played out in multiple ways. The prosperity gospel was created basically by poor people who were trying to mimic the status quo.
Wow.
I mean, that's at the bottom. It was like they're these are the people that taught us Christianity. They're wealthy. So, as we get into this, as we trust God, God's gonna give us wealth. And then there became this, and then it became individual, and you combine that with individualism. So I think that's what happened with that. I think that one of the most profound, when we talk about the perversion of how race and other idols, the idolatries of Christendom, one of them is individualism.
Wow.
This is that there is,
which is fundamentally American.
A fundamentally American, Mark.
Wow.
Fundamentally American. So but it's a myth. It even gets played out as Kyle was saying, in our version of Christianity. Christianity becomes about Jesus and me, Jesus saving my soul so that I can go to heaven. It has nothing to do with my circumstances. It's very interesting. One of the documentaries I mentioned, the Aerial America documentary on the Smithsonian channel. Another documentary. There's the guy. What's his name? He's done several great documentaries. Anyway, there's a documentary on History Channel on the Quakers, and it talks about how this profound focus on spirituality got played out though with communal living and this simplicity, but a high standard of community and cleanliness and order and structure. Now, of course, there were perversions in that, but what I appreciate about that is that they, even with the profound spirituality, profound otherworldliness, that they understood that impacts even how you the architecture of a building. That it impacts even how you plant your gardens. And that's so at least you're leaning in the direction that it ain't just about me, Jesus, in heaven, right? Which is a perversion. So with that, and then your second question was,
it was related to
how do we heal both groups? How do we heal both?
If we're hurt differently by this idolatry,
right?
Then how do you deliver healing to these two very different populations of people?
And I think that's where our communal interpretation of the faith comes in so important. So that means that I, as a Black man, cannot do it alone. That I can only do that healing work in community with others. So that's why one of the reasons Pastor Kyle has become so important to me, Mark. You've become important because each one of you is helping me to I think I'm trying to be a healing presence for a certain demographic of people. So for Pastor Kyle, he helps me because he speaks the language of how do I speak to white people and tell them and call them to repentance, but to do so in love and with my own humility and my own brokenness. And he talks about how people need to embrace how they can embrace power and privilege, but use it for the sake of others. So that gives me the theology and language to do that healing. So it calls people to repentance, but it also affirms their humanity. And then there are other people who challenge me in the sense of, but Pastor, what do you do with this white Jesus? So then I'm in community with them because they help me to understand, to stay in contact with that psyche, with that hurt and that wound, and to speak to that. You help me because I'm always thinking about the Mark McCormicks, who, as I'm writing a sermon, what are these people who are going to ask me intellectual questions about the statement I just made? Okay. Who are the people who are going to say, actually, Pastor, I can get with that spiritually, but I'm also thinking about it. And it ain't making a whole lot of like the pieces don't fit. Now, if you tell me I just got accepted by faith, that's cool. I'm just telling you that the pieces don't fit. Like I'm hearing those voices.
Yeah, and how close can you get me?
Yeah, how close can you get me? And I want to be a healing presence. And so my point is that we can't bring healing as one church or as one faith community, as one pastor. It takes all of us working together in community to provide healing for all of us. Yeah. Does that make sense, Mark?
It does.
Kyle, how would you say? What would you say?
I agree with anything you say.
You get a car. You get.
I mean, I don't feel like we really scratched the surface of what I wanted to get to tonight. Maybe we have to do this again.
Yeah.
But I was really struck by this last part of the discussion about, the perversions of faith. One of the things I saw in Selma, Rev, was an African-American church that had two front facades, one on a side street, one on the main street. And the tour guide explained that the one facing the main street was the original entrance. But a local ordinance passed by Christians essentially said the sight of Black people walking in and out of this church is so offensive, we need to make them not use that entrance and build an entrance on the side street so that we don't have to see Black people entering and exiting the building. And that monstrosity is still there for everyone to see. It seems like if you're doing any kind of faith and you're earnest, it's a lot of self-reflection, a lot of introspection. And that's not what I feel like our white nationalist brothers and sisters are doing. It's all sort of external.
Yeah.
This is what's wrong with you, as opposed to how can I grow
Right.
and become closer in my walk with God and Jesus, and trying to be more like Jesus.
Right. Wow. Wow. Kyle, you were about to say something.
I was just reminded too of, you said that monstrosity is still there, and the name of Edmund Pettus is still on the bridge, where I think it's that town is a majority African American town now.
It is.
And that folks drive under that name day after day. The name of, I forget, Grand Master or whatever, the Ku Klux Klan and political stalwart. It's a daily reminder, and just part of the air one breathes in that community.
But the challenge again is, how widespread these perversions are.
Mm-hmm.
When I was writing at my old museum there in Wichita about the presence of the Klan in Wichita, the description of the Klan was essentially they are super patriotic and super Christian.
Mm.
Yeah.
We still have a major party dominated by people who are super patriotic and super Christian, and that we have been unable to untether the two. There's this incredible conflation of the two. That's not the only problem in Christianity, but it's part of the discussion that we were having tonight.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, and as we close, I'll tell you a couple of things that I think that can be healing in turn. So that we've kind of focused on one form of the idolatry, and that's the race issue. There are many others. I can tell you a story about how in the churches. So I did a church plant. We planted a church and how I got caught up in that and trying to grow the church growth movement. How do you, as a matter of fact, it became such a business approach that the guy who trained me, he would literally talk about growing church as getting butts in the seats. Okay.
Wow.
So how do you get butts in the seats? So that, we're talking about calling people to calling people to faith, calling people to live to their deepest humanity, but it's been described as
you're not overstating that. There was an idea about how to build a mega church.
Right, exactly. Yes.
And that was part of the formula. That was part of the formula.
And so we were engaged in that work, and I had gotten lost in it. I will tell you guys, I had gotten lost in that. I mean, and it became to the point that I became an anxious presence for people, just like angry, like trying to make people like show up for something. And we were at a Bible study one night, and this guy walks in, he and his wife, and you could tell they had just kind of reconnected. They told us, but they walked in, they were very quiet. They walked in the Bible study. And the guy looked like he looked rough. Like she looked like she was somewhat gathered, but he looked scattered. And we started talking about how could we get butts in the seats. And so in that discussion, somebody said, we need to start having like dinners after church and feed people. So as Pastor Kyle will tell you, that's one of the trinkets is to do a meal after church. So and we said, oh, that's a great idea, and we can do crock pots, and we start creating this vision. We're gonna do crock pots, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna feed people. And this guy interrupted us crying, Mark. And he said, what does feeding people have to do with growing a church? Have y'all never been hungry? And it crushed me. Like I was like, man, like, it was like that aha moment where you wake up and you realize your soul has been dying. And I'm like, oh my God. And he was crying. And I'm like, oh my God. And he was like, who? Like these are God's people? Church. And they're talking about feeding people as a tool to grow a church, rather than just feeding people because it's wrong for people to be hungry and you can do something about it.
He just reduced it to a transaction.
Yes. Yes. So that's another one of these idolatries that we have to deal with. But I will tell you that I think healing, I think being present for each other and finding that bro and speaking into that in the way that people. So I realized last summer I had a chance to go to North Mississippi, and I've told both of you all about this. And I went and to the area where, and this same within a 30-mile radius is the spot where Robert Johnson, the blues player, allegedly sold his soul to the devil. Pastor Kyle's gonna meditate on that tonight and said there's a connection between Robert and this guy. I need to do a Sankofa and do my research and see if Robert's related to this guy. So with that and the store where Emmett Till entered,
Oh wow!
and another 26 miles over is the little church that Fannie Lou Hamer walked into in her first protest meeting, in her first so the first meeting she went to get involved in social activism.
Oh, wow.
All that is right. And it just like I left that place just like rattled. And then it came out when the movie Till came out, all of that emotion, because during that movie I started weeping and couldn't stop. I was weeping uncontrollably to the point that my wife caught my arm and said, "Do we need to leave?" It was that bad. And I was like, "No, I got to stay here." But it was that bad. And so I realized then one of my mentors, Kirby John, said years ago in a sermon, he said, right after slavery, one of the things they should have done for all Black people is require that all Black people get therapy. And we all laughed that day. But after that movie, that statement came alive for me. And I'm like, man, all this trauma that's pinned up in me that needs to be healed. And it can only be healed by people like Kyle who offered friendship. And like part of the guard came down. Or Dan, the folks who do the Thursday night podcast with me, who came and just showed up at St. Mark and said, "Hey, we want to invite him and Linda to the vineyard." We hung out with him, but those kinds of acts, Mark, that Paul talked about, is white people showing up in the right spaces and not only trying to understand racism, but doing the work to tear it down. That's been so healing for me. So in the same, and I think for what's interesting for me is for all these people is that they were people who were trying to follow Jesus, and that's why this whole subject is important for me. Is that I think the people who are doing the most important work, some of the most important work, to not only address these evils but to actually heal them and get us beyond them are people who are trying to do that as representations of the life and ministry of Jesus.
As you said before, the humility is important. Sorry,
humility is important. Yeah.
So real quick, just you're mentioning therapy and trauma. Would recommend is My Grandmother's Hands. I don't know if either of you are familiar with it, by Resmaa Menakem.
Huh. I know the song, but I don't know the book.
It is Racialized Trauma and the Pathways to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. It is specifically about racial trauma.
Okay.
Has three audiences in mind. African Americans, whites, and police officers.
Wow.
And talks about how trauma is literally stored in our bodies and passed down generationally.
Wow.
And has very practical exercises in thinking specifically about racial trauma. And if there's anybody on here that is at all feels like, because I think we don't even realize how it affects us either. It's a bit of a lengthier book. It's not an easy read by any means, and it's meant to be practiced and not just read.
Yeah.
But I think I would imagine there are a lot of people who would really find it helpful and important.
Is she out of your ECC circles?
No.
Okay.
I think it's he. It's out of Minneapolis, but he's He's a social worker, licensed therapist. Has appeared on the Oprah Winfrey show.
Okay.
For what that's worth.
Well,
but very knowledgeable about the effects of trauma, and especially as it relates to race.
We haven't even begun to fully uncover the depth of trauma and how it's passed on. We do a little of that talk. If Fox Peterson is still watching, that's part of what she does. You all been noting that she and Rob Simon here in the city are into what they call restorative practice, which I was blown away by. They met my daughter, who's a school teacher in Atlanta, and then we were kind of discussing. And my daughter said, "Oh yeah, we're doing restorative practice in the school system in that school system in Atlanta, North Atlanta, where she is." So, well, guys, it's 8:40. This has been great. Mark, thank you so much for being our guest interviewer.
Thanks for having me again.
It was absolutely. And Paul came on and just added icing on the cake. And Kyle, thank you so much as always. I'll be out the next couple of weeks. So folks, Ignite will take a break for couple of weeks, and then we'll be back. Don't know where I will. I'm sure whatever we do, we may pick up where we left off, Mark, and kind of continue this conversation and go a little further down, talk about the central message of Jesus, talk about the king, what the kingdom is and what that means and how that, and then talk about what would it look like to do some Sankofa trips that were built around the healing of trauma as connected to faith, Christian faith and practice. Well, are you familiar with the term Sankofa, Mark?
I am.
Yes. So we had a lady who leads those trips out of the ECC, Evangelical Covenant Church, out of those circles, and she came on and did some stuff, and we've been talking about doing that. Resurrection Church has been doing some Sankofa trips in partnership with St. James United Methodist Church, which is, of course, Emmanuel Cleaver. Now his son leads that church now. They've done some Sankofa. They took a trip to Birmingham, the two churches together. So folks are doing this, traveling and experiencing these places where these traumatic things happen.
Heavy.
It's heavy. It's heavy.
If I could, real quick, my Sunday column is about sitting in the newsroom there in Wichita and getting a call from the lobby that the police were coming upstairs to arrest me.
Wow.
Over some parking tickets.
Wow.
And I'm relating that to what happened here, where the kid rang the wrong doorbell.
Yeah.
Was shot in the head. The man walked out and shot the kid again.
Yeah.
He then went to 3 houses before anyone helped him.
Yeah.
And then the man who shot him got to turn himself in 4 or 5 days later.
Yeah.
But I mean, when I saw how long that guy got to just exist at home before he was charged or even arrested, and then he got to turn himself in.
Yeah.
Juxtapose that with what I experienced.
Yeah.
I was looking at getting perp walked in front of all of my colleagues.
Over traffic tickets.
Over a traffic ticket.
Right. Wow. Yeah.
And the arbitrariness of police power sometimes. But it does ignite a trauma in people that you may not even know is really there.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Wow. This has been great. Thank you all so much. I will see you all when I return. We'll talk while I'm away about what we want to do when we come back. Maybe Pastor, I don't know where Yolanda will be, but Kai may be through with school and he can chime in with us. Be great to have him back, do some stuff with Paul, but we'll talk about that. Folks, thank you all for listening. They've stayed tuned in. Thank you all so much. And Nichelle, thank you so much, sister. Love you. You're such a blessing. And God bless you all. We'll see you soon.